The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of a nuclear apocalypse. It's commonly believed that nuclear war was only averted thanks to the Americans and the actions of their charismatic president, John F. Kennedy. But is that really true? In the fall of 1961, the U.S. stationed 15 Jupiter medium-range missiles near Izmir in Turkey. These missiles were armed with nuclear warheads, whose destructive power was about 100 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In just 10 minutes, they could have reached Moscow and unleashed a nuclear nightmare on the Soviet Union. For the USSR and its leader Nikita Khrushchev, this existential threat on their doorstep was an intolerable provocation by the Americans. They had to respond. In 1961, the Cold War was approaching its peak. A summit held in early June in Vienna between the more experienced Nikita Khrushchev and the newly elected U.S. President, John F. Kennedy, only served to exacerbate tensions between the two world powers. Especially when it came to Germany. Khrushchev insisted that the Western powers pull out of West Berlin. This Western enclave in the middle of East Germany presented an exit point to the millions of East Germans fleeing communism. Kennedy refused. While West Berlin was a thorn in the side of the communist bloc, even thornier for the Americans was the issue of the island of Cuba. 2 years earlier, Fidel Castro had seized power and had since forged closer ties to the Soviet Union. Kennedy feared that if Castro's revolution were successful, it would serve as a model for the neighboring countries. He was willing to use any means necessary to bring down the Cuban regime.
We do not intend to be lectured on intervention by those whose character was stamped for all time on the bloody streets of Budapest. Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists, and we do not intend to abandon it either.
In April 1961, an attempt by U.S.-trained Cuban exiles to land at the Bay of Pigs ended in a disastrous fiasco. Within a few days, more than 1,300 men from the CIA-led operation were killed, wounded, or captured by Fidel Castro's army. Khrushchev's response was a warning to America. As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, we will render the Cuban people and their government all necessary help to repel armed attack on Cuba. Kennedy did not give up. He assigned a secret mission to the CIA and the Department of Defense. At the end of 1961, Operation Mongoose was launched with the goal of destabilizing Cuban society. With 400 agents and an annual budget of $50 million, the program was run by the CIA from a location in Miami. Operation Mongoose financed economic sabotage and propaganda. But it also included a plot to assassinate the Cuban revolutionary leader. The military were involved too. Top officers devised scenarios that could serve as a pretext to invade the island, such as staging fake attacks in the U.S. or sinking a refugee boat on its way to Florida, and then blaming the Cubans. The CIA even considered lacing Fidel Castro's cigars with poison or explosives. Nothing was off limits when it came to bringing down the Cuban government.
Todo este instrumental había entrado en Cuba en valija diplomática de la embajada yanqui. Los espías habían hecho perforaciones en el piso para instalar los micrófonos y captar todo cuanto ocurriese en el apartamento del piso inferior, sede de la agencia cablegráfica Xinhua. Así utilizan los yanquis su embajada, como centro de conspiración, interferencia en los asuntos que solo competen al pueblo cubano, espionaje y violación de la soberanía de Cuba.
While Kennedy focused on regime change in Cuba, Khrushchev was considering the East German government's plan to seal off the way to West Berlin. He finally agreed. In August 1961, barbed wire and temporary fences were erected at the border between the occupation zones. Later, they were replaced by a wall. Kennedy responded by stationing Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara justified the measure.
Made since January 20, actions were taken to increase both the nuclear and non-nuclear strength of the armed forces. These actions were inescapable in the face of the aggressive atmosphere in the Far East.
Khrushchev was outraged, especially since the U.S. already had the upper hand, possessing over 24,000 nuclear warheads, while the USSR had just under 2,500. How could Khrushchev compensate for this disadvantage? He ran an idea by his defense minister. What about putting one of our hedgehogs down the Americans' trousers? The hedgehogs were nuclear missiles. And the trousers were Cuba. The Soviet head of government was hoping to kill two birds with one stone: to protect the island and the Castro regime, while at the same time making it clear to Kennedy that he could not deploy medium-range missiles on the USSR's doorstep without consequences. Fidel Castro agreed to Khrushchev's plan, but wanted to make their cooperation official. He feared that the nuclear deployment would turn international public opinion against him. In his eyes, Cuba was a sovereign state with the right to openly possess nuclear weapons, especially in the light of attacks and consistent violent U.S. intervention in his country, which he repeatedly denounced.
A su señoría el delegado de los Estados Unidos, aprovecho la oportunidad para decirle que hay muchas madres de Cuba esperando todavía su telegrama de condolencia por los hijos que les asesinaron las bombas de los Estados Unidos.
Khrushchev did not want to hear about it. Military aid, yes, but only under the utmost secrecy. He did not want to force the U.S.'s hand. In June 1962, Khrushchev succeeded in convincing the members of the Soviet Presidium of his plan. He claimed that the U.S. was planning to invade Cuba with its own armed forces. The U.S. needed to be shown that an attack on the island would not only mean facing Cuban resistance, but also the nuclear might of the Soviet Union. Operation Anadir was launched. The goal was to secretly transport more than 50,000 men, 40 long-range R-12 and R-14 nuclear missiles, 80 tactical nuclear warheads, state-of-the-art air defense systems, and numerous vehicles to the island of Cuba. To this end, the largest covert Soviet operation of the Cold War was set in motion, the cargo concealed in commercial freighters. Maximum secrecy was required for the operation. The soldiers did not even know their destination. This also applied to the captains of the 85 cargo ships. Some of them set sail from the Baltic Sea, others from the Black Sea, and one from the Arctic Ocean. It was only upon reaching the high seas that the captains opened an envelope containing instructions for the rest of their journey. Submarines equipped with ballistic missiles were also to be stationed in Cuba. But despite the secrecy, the Americans quickly smelled a rat. Or at least one American did, the new CIA director, John McCone.
Let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible.
He'd been appointed by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs disaster. He first noted the unusual arrival of 21 Soviet cargo ships in Cuba in July. In a meeting on August 10th, he warned Kennedy that the Soviets were preparing to station nuclear missiles in Cuba. But for the most part, his warnings fell on deaf ears in the White House. Kennedy considered it possible that there were anti-aircraft missiles in Cuba, but believed that such defensive weapons posed no threat to the U.S. Nonetheless, he deployed reconnaissance aircraft to monitor the Soviet ships. At the beginning of August, dozens of nuclear warheads arrived in Cuba. At the same time, the newly married CIA director traveled to the French Riviera for his honeymoon. From his vacation spot, McCone continued to follow developments in Cuba. Although he had no concrete evidence of the cargo ship's contents, he was convinced that there were nuclear missiles on board. In early September, he wrote to his deputy director that it seemed entirely possible to him that the Soviets were trying to keep secret the presence of offensive nuclear missiles. A few days later, McCone sent another telegram. Also believe we must carefully study the prospect of secret importation and placement of several Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles. His analysts do not seem to share his concerns. McCone's messages were classified as the honeymoon cables. Worse still, at the same time, his agency published a report that directly contradicted him. Soviet deployment of medium-range missiles on the island was unlikely. On returning to the U.S., the CIA director was alarmed. Little importance had been attached to the matter, and aerial reconnaissance over Cuba had already been suspended again. On October 9th, McCone convinced President Kennedy to resume reconnaissance flights. It wasn't until October 14th that a Lockheed U-2 took off from Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. The aircraft was equipped with special cameras. It would fly over Cuba and gather as much information as possible. Once it returned, the film was immediately evaluated. There were 928 photos in total, and the result of the analysis was clear. Cuba had launch sites for offensive missiles capable of reaching the U.S. Worse still, these missiles could be armed with nuclear warheads. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy waited until the next morning. On October 16, 1962, he informed the president. Kennedy was horrified. He had not believed Khrushchev capable of such a move. During a meeting with his brother and advisor, Robert Kennedy, the president gave free rein to his anger toward the Soviet leader. He called him a gangster and a liar. The CIA and U.S. intelligence had failed. Only John McCone had tried in vain to alert the White House. But now, Soviet military equipment had arrived in Cuba and was ready for use. The new situation hardly changed the nuclear balance of power. For several years, the USSR had possessed missiles that could reach the U.S. quickly. The Americans were still very concerned. The weapons would put Castro in a position to attack them. The operation could also be a sign of an imminent Soviet move in Berlin. The security of West Berlin depended on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. If Kennedy didn't respond decisively, Khrushchev might think he had a free hand to march into the part of the city controlled by the Western Allies. The U.S. was under pressure to act. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council on October 16th. He needed solutions for this crisis. Members included Vice President Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, as well as Robert Kennedy. President Kennedy had installed a recording system in the White House. Over the coming days, their meetings were to be secretly recorded.
But we can expect you would have to have in the back of your own mind, whatever decision you take, the possibility of the likelihood of a Soviet reaction somewhere else, running all the way from Berlin right around to Korea, and the possibility of a reaction against the United States itself. That no one can surely foresee the outcome.
Tensions were high.
Had we done nothing, communism Castro would spread through the hemisphere as the government was frightened by its new evidence of power had toppled.
On this first day, participants were almost unanimous. The Soviet facilities in Cuba must be destroyed. Various scenarios were suggested. The president was in favor of a surgical strike. His defense minister advocated a larger attack that would also target air bases. U.S. leadership saw an opportunity to realize the long-held plan of the U.S. to invade Cuba and remove Castro from power. The talks ended without a clear decision. For Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis came at a very inopportune moment, in the middle of the midterm election campaign. A series of rallies were planned for the next day in Connecticut. He couldn't cancel them, as any last-minute change would alert the media. The Cuban issue was now his top priority, but it couldn't become public. On October 17th, campaigner Kennedy arrived in Stratford.
The fact of the matter is that the great fight in 1962 is the same fight that we waged in 1960 and must be waged in this decade. And that is to provide employment for our people, education for our children, and security for our older citizens. And that job, in my opinion, can only be done by the Democratic Party.
While Kennedy rushed from one rally to the next, Nikita Khrushchev in Russia was working on a new smokescreen. With the unwitting help of his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. On October 18th, Gromyko arrived in Washington for a long-planned diplomatic visit. For the U.S., it was an opportune moment to broach the issue with the USSR without raising public concern. Kennedy mentioned the numerous Soviet cargo ships that had arrived in Cuba in recent months, without, however, revealing that the U.S. knew full well what the cargo consisted of. Khrushchev had not informed Gromyko about the delivery of the nuclear missiles. The Soviet foreign minister swore that the USSR's assistance was for defensive purposes only, insisting that there was never any question of providing Cuba with nuclear warheads capable of reaching the U.S. Kennedy tried to keep his composure. Khrushchev was highly satisfied. The plan was working. The delivery of nuclear weapons to Cuba proceeded unhindered, while Soviet submarines took up positions near the island. The next day, October 19th, the president called a meeting of his Joint Chiefs of Staff. He wanted to hear the military assessment. According to the generals, a surgical strike would not necessarily guarantee the complete destruction of the missiles. The only solution was to invade Cuba. The maneuvers that would begin simultaneously on the beaches of Florida would prove the clear superiority of the U.S. Army. It could solve the problem within a few days, but for Kennedy, this plan was unacceptable. The Western leader could not justify aggression against the small country, not to mention possible Soviet retaliation. General LeMay makes a final comment to the president.
You're on a pretty bad fix, President.
We say?
You're on a pretty bad fix.
You're in with me.
After the meeting, Kennedy commented to his personal assistant, "These brass hats have one great advantage in their favor. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong." Two executive committee meetings were convened on October 20th and 21st, during which Kennedy announced his final decision. They were going to stop the Soviet cargo ships with a naval blockade of the island.
The argument for the blockade was that what we want to do is avoid every kind of nuclear war, provide for escalation, for imbalance. Soviets increase, taking additional action to comes up with some degree of control.
7 days had passed since the photos had proved the deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. Life went on as usual. No one suspected the deadly threat hanging over the world. But it wouldn't remain a secret for much longer. Kennedy was preparing to reveal the events in a radio and television address scheduled for October 22nd. The day before, he had sent Dean Acheson to Europe to inform the NATO allies directly. Presented with a fait accompli, the Europeans had no choice but to give President Kennedy the green light. The world press was mobilized to underscore the significance of this speech. In order not to embarrass the Soviets, Secretary of State Dean Rusk received the USSR ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, at 6 p.m. He handed him a copy of the speech that Kennedy would deliver an hour later. Dobrynin was stunned. He had not been informed about the deployment of medium-range missiles.
The President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on the island of Cuba. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The facts were finally on the table. Everyone was now aware of the nuclear threat to the U.S. Kennedy demanded an end to the ongoing operation, or the U.S. would retaliate. Finally, he announced a quarantine of Cuba. All ships, regardless of nationality, would be intercepted and forced to turn back if they had offensive weapons on board.
Cargoes of offensive weapons be turned back. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
Apocalyptic fear took hold across the world. Panicked masses bought everything off of store shelves. Fallout shelters were prepared. From the Vatican, Pope John XXIII made an urgent appeal to world leaders.
Nous supplions tous les gouvernants de ne pas rester sourds à ce cri de l'humanité, qu'ils fassent tout ce qui est en eux pour sauver la paix. Ils éviteront ainsi au monde les horreurs d'une guerre dont nul ne peut prévoir quelles seraient les effroyables conséquences.
On the morning of October 23rd, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's speech with a short letter. He condemned the aggressive action, which violated the United Nations Charter and freedom of navigation. He reiterated that the weapons delivered to Cuba were for defensive purposes only, and hoped that the Americans would refrain from taking the proposed action, which could have catastrophic consequences for world peace. At the same time, he put the armed forces of the Eastern Bloc on high alert. The U.S. war machine had also been mobilized.
I have taken the necessary steps to deploy our forces to be positioned to make effective the quarantine at 2 p.m. tomorrow, Greenwich time. That will be the equivalent of 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The forces are ordered to interdict delivery of offensive weapons and associated material to Cuba. Those are the instructions we've been given. Those are the instructions we will carry out.
More than 40 ships set course for the Caribbean. At the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay in southeastern Cuba, the families of military personnel were hurriedly evacuated to the U.S. As fear gripped the world, a performance at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow was drawing to a close. Khrushchev appeared to be at ease. What better way to reassure the masses than a visit to the opera in the middle of a geopolitical crisis? At 10 o'clock on the morning of October 24th, the quarantine of Cuba officially began. Within a few hours, the first Soviet ships would reach the blockade line of U.S. warships waiting to intercept them. At the same time, the U.S. military elevated the DEFCON level to 2, the most extreme alert level before nuclear war. All U.S. nuclear weapons worldwide were activated. A conflict of unthinkable proportions was imminent. It was a critical moment, and Kennedy was tense. What if Soviet ships broke through the blockade? Was this armed confrontation really necessary? At the same time, there were 4 ships carrying nuclear warheads approaching Cuba. But what Kennedy didn't know was that Khrushchev had already given them the order to turn back. The Soviet leader believed that there were already enough nuclear warheads stationed in Cuba. But the order did not apply to all ships. Other Soviet freighters continued their journey, ready to break through the blockade. Like the tanker Bucharest, the U.S. Navy gave chase. A destroyer approached to board the ship. The tension was at breaking point. The Soviet captain was contacted by radio. He claimed that the ship was only transporting fuel. Finally, the Americans allowed the ship to pass. They considered it unlikely that it was carrying offensive weapons. The first day of the quarantine ends without any major incidents, much to the relief of the National Security Council. But the matter was far from resolved.
Well, now the quarantine itself won't remove the weapons. So you're going to get 2 ways of removing the weapons. One is to negotiate them out, in other words, trade them out, or the other is to go in and take them out. I don't see any other way you're going to get the weapons out.
At the United Nations on Thursday, the 4th day of crisis, the conflict is carried on among the diplomats of the world. Here in this political forum, representatives of each of the nations involved in the global dispute are given the opportunity to hear and be heard, nation against nation, face to face, in dramatic confrontation.
The USSR's ambassador to the UN, Valerian Zorin, accuses the U.S. of piracy. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson then confronts him directly.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The U.S. ambassador then presented 2 photos taken by American reconnaissance aircraft. They clearly showed structures that a trained eye would identify as missile launch pads. The images reinforced the generally held belief that the USSR had initiated hostilities. It was Khrushchev who took the first step toward a diplomatic solution. He attempted to de-escalate this situation, where one false move by either side could mean far-reaching consequences for humanity. On October 25th, he convened the Presidium of the Central Committee, where he announced his willingness to withdraw the nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba. In exchange, he would demand a pledge from Kennedy that the U.S. desist from all attempts to invade the island and overthrow Castro. That was Khrushchev's ultimate goal, to secure the long-term survival of this socialist country and thorn in the side of the West. The next evening, the U.S. government received a letter from Khrushchev. Defense Secretary McNamara would later say of it, "We received the most extraordinary diplomatic cable I have ever seen." It was a rambling, emotional letter raising the specter of nuclear holocaust, but at its core was the offer to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a pledge from the U.S. not to invade Cuba. The letter reassured Kennedy that his counterpart was willing to negotiate. On the evening of October 26th, a second letter was written in Moscow, this time in a more formal style. And Khrushchev was upping the stakes. In addition to security for Cuba, he demanded the withdrawal of U.S. missiles stationed in Turkey. The contents of the new letter were first broadcast on Radio Moscow. Western journalists quickly picked up on the news. On October 27th, the U.S. president received the morning reports. Kennedy now knew that another letter from Khrushchev was on its way with this new demand, and he could see the rationale behind it. If the U.S. objected to offensive missiles stationed in Cuba on the grounds that they could easily reach the U.S., then it was understandable, in turn, that the USSR did not want U.S. missiles in Europe. But most of his security advisors were against the new demand. They believed that Kennedy should simply accept Khrushchev's offer from the previous day. The withdrawal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise not to attack the island. On this long day of October 27th, the discussions dragged on. The threat of a nuclear catastrophe persisted, and the scales could easily have tipped in the wrong direction. On the same day, an American U-2 aircraft, on its way to collect air samples from the Arctic Circle, strayed off course. The pilot violated Soviet airspace. Russian fighter jets took up the chase. Discovering that one of its aircraft was in distress, the U.S. Air Force Command sent in its own fighter jets to rescue it. Due to the DEFCON 2 alert status, the U.S. fighter jets were armed with nuclear missiles. The U-2 was about to be intercepted by Soviet aircraft, but in the end, it managed to exit Soviet airspace. On learning of the incident, Kennedy remarked, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." Khrushchev himself was shocked to think an intruding U.S. plane might push us to a fateful step. Just a few hours after this incident, a different U.S. aircraft was shot down over Cuba by an anti-aircraft missile. The order was given by Soviet military personnel on the ground, despite orders from Moscow to the contrary. The pilot, Rudolf Anderson, was killed. Fidel Castro, convinced that an airstrike on the island was imminent, sent Khrushchev an urgent telegram asking him to consider a nuclear strike. Khrushchev was stunned. Kennedy rejected any retaliatory measures. Both in the White House and in the Kremlin, the heads of government were aware that a single spark could set the world on fire. And these weren't the only potentially inflammatory incidents. Soviet submarines were still operating in the quarantine zone, and the U.S. fleet was now hunting them down. Two of them surfaced and were immediately detected. The submarine B-59, on the other hand, was still underwater. It had left its base 3 weeks earlier and hadn't had any contact with Moscow since arriving in the Sargasso Sea. The radio operator was only receiving short excerpts from American radio news reports. The crew could only speculate whether World War III had already begun. And there was another issue. Their boat was built for Arctic waters and had no cooling system. The temperature on board was almost 40 degrees Celsius, and they were running out of oxygen. On October 27th, the U.S. Navy spotted them. To force the submarine to surface, the Americans dropped depth charges. The Russian commander assumed an attack was imminent. He believed he was at war and was prepared to launch a 5-kiloton nuclear missile. Fortunately, Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov managed to dissuade him, and the submarine was brought to the surface instead. The disaster was averted at the last second. After this extreme escalation, Kennedy was keen to end the conflict with a diplomatic solution. He discussed the draft of a letter with his advisors. It contained an offer to discuss the USSR's proposals. However, Kennedy assumed that Khrushchev would reject any proposal that didn't include the withdrawal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Although his advisors were against it, the president was prepared to meet this demand too. The problem was NATO's partners. How would his allies react to the withdrawal of weapons supposed to protect them from a Soviet invasion? At a meeting of select advisors, Kennedy announced his decision to comply with Khrushchev's request. Secretary of State Dean Rusk suggested a solution that wouldn't offend NATO partners. The Russians should be guaranteed the withdrawal of missiles from Turkey, but to be enforced a bit later, once the current crisis had been resolved. That way, Khrushchev would get what he wanted, without the public knowing that the U.S. had conceded to the Russian demands. Robert Kennedy was tasked with informing Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin of the U.S. answer, which he did on an unofficial visit that evening. He justified the delay, saying, "To withdraw these bases from Turkey, we need 4 to 5 months. This is the minimal amount of time, taking into account the procedures that exist within the NATO framework." Robert Kennedy gave Dobrynin a direct number to the White House, which would allow him to call as soon as he received Khrushchev's response. The outcome of the crisis now depended on Moscow. Robert Kennedy returned to the president, who tried to stay calm as they waited for the Soviet response. When Khrushchev read the American proposal, he was astonished. he had not expected Kennedy to offer him the withdrawal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. In fact, he was in the process of confirming their previous agreement. Immediately, the Soviet leader sent a telegram to Dobrynin, urging him to accept the offer. Khrushchev then announced on Radio Moscow that he'd agreed to the withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a security guarantee for Fidel Castro's government. And in compliance with the Americans' request, he made no mention of the missiles in Turkey. On October 28th, the crisis was over. News reached Washington at 9 a.m. Everyone sighed a breath of relief. Most of his advisors congratulated the president. Only the military chiefs of staff were reluctant to abandon the plans to attack Castro's Cuba. Admiral George Anderson even went so far as to say, "We were duped." Such reactions from his military chiefs of staff were quite shocking to Kennedy. The young president's victory was celebrated everywhere. In the eyes of the world, he had forced the USSR to back down. The crisis was over after 13 long days. The peaceful solution paved the way for a period of better relations between the USSR and the USA. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established, opening a direct channel of communication. Several treaties regulating the proliferation of nuclear weapons were signed. A meeting between Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Nikita Khrushchev on the Black Sea coast in 1963 was seen as proof that relations were improving.
Mr. Rusk said that they touched on many things in a relaxed atmosphere, but reached no conclusions on any further agreements. Later, the meeting adjourned to a recreation room, where Mr. Khrushchev took on Mr. Rusk at badminton. Decked out in his Ukrainian blouse, the Russian leader defeated the American. But that's the life of a diplomat.
But under a more critical lens, Kennedy's supposed victory came because of a crisis that might not have broken out without former U.S. aggression against Cuba. Fidel Castro was initially furious about Khrushchev's decision. But the following year, he ended the rift between the two countries by making an official trip to the USSR. Khrushchev also acted to protect Cuba from further U.S. aggression. And in this respect, he was successful. The Cuban regime has survived till this day. As for the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Turkey, Defense Secretary McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk claimed in February 1963 before a House of Representatives committee that the withdrawal had nothing to do with the secret deal involving Cuba. And thus, the president's popularity remained unscathed during the midterm election campaign, as did the myth that America would never give in to communism. Nikita Khrushchev, who was forced out of office in October 1964, did not benefit politically from any of this. It was not until 1987 that the secret agreement was revealed.